1917 is the worst year in Australian history. Not just the worst year in any war, the worst year in the history of the inhabitants of this continent. For in that year, 22,000 Australian soldiers are killed in action. We know the places: Bullecourt, Messines, Passchendaele. 22,000 grieving families. Yet amidst the gloom, 1917 saw something else. A lightning flash, far out in the Negev desert, the charge of Harry Chevelle's light horse at Beersheba. What sort of a man is this Harry Chevelle? He's quiet, he's reserved, almost shy, and yet a very convinced disciplinarian. He'd learnt the necessity for that and was critical of some of the Australian troops during the Boer War in South Africa. Some see him as a bit of a martinet. But his headquarters are always forward with the troops. When he was on Gallipoli, Colonel Cannon, commanding the 15th Battalion of the AIF, says Harry Chevelle's the coolest man he's seen under fire. He used to take a swim at Gallipoli during the May engagements. A remarkable man and a sincere Christian. Carries a Bible in his saddlebags all through the campaign.
When Allenby, early in 1917, became the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force in the Middle East, he suddenly met two people that lifted his spirits, because he'd been kicked out of the Western Front because Haig and others didn't want him there. He was a threat. He was a very good general, and he was a threat. There was an excuse after the Battle of Arras, which was lost by the Brits. He was shoved over to the Middle East to get rid of him. And he was very down on this. The British Prime Minister said, look, it's very important to liberate Palestine, and it's very important for Christians that you do this, and so forth and so on. He wasn't convinced. In the first week, he met T. Lawrence and was very impressed and said, well, you can have what you want over there in Jordan and Arabia, I'll back it with gold, and so forth. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. Then he met Harry Chevelle, 5'5" of him. Allenby was about 6'4", big, gruff, in your face all the time with the soldiers, aggressive individual. And he couldn't quite get Harry's measure because he couldn't bluff him. Everyone else fell apart. Harry would leave long pauses between comments, and for example, he said, I want to go direct to your Prime Minister over troops and money and funding for this war. He said, no, you're not doing that, said Harry. We've always used Birdwood, who's been with us since Gallipoli, and we're not going to let him down now. He's the link. And Allenby got very upset, and he said, well, we're going to have these people on your staff. And he said, no, you're not. Well, I'm leaving these people on my staff. They've been with me all the time. So he never had anyone fronting him like that. And he actually told Banjo Patterson, who knew him from the Boer War, effectively said, I'm going to get rid of Harry Chevelle. And it was Banjo that said, well, you can't do that. He's the most effective general in this war, because he was dealing out the horses from the remount division. He knew exactly what Harry was about, how successful he'd been. And it's no fault of his that we lost the two battles of Gaza. That was your British Army that did that, and your people pulling them back from the front when they were about to win and send the cavalry in to finish it off. But then he did his homework and found out that Banjo was absolutely correct about Harry. He made him the battle commander of the entire light horse, which is pretty big, because there are plenty of other Brits around that could have taken over, cavalry and so forth, but no, he realised that Chevelle was a winner.
It had been a classic light horse approach over several nights, through waterless terrain, 40 minutes in the hour in the saddle, 10 minutes leading, 10 minutes resting. The resting was for the horses. And dawn sees them 6 kilometres to the southeast of Beersheba. Harry Chevelle knows two things. First, his horses must have water today. They've been without it for 48 hours, some of them longer. Secondly, he must take Beersheba today, the 31st of October 1917. Otherwise, General Allenby's plan for the Third Battle of Gaza will fail, as had the two previous battles for Gaza in March and April. There's water, Harry knows, 15 miles or so behind. There should be water in Beersheba. He can't attack until General Chaytor's New Zealanders have cleared out a strong point to the east of Beersheba, a place called Tel El Saba. It takes them pretty well all day. It's 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun is sinking into the heat haze. The mosque in Beersheba is a white smudge amidst the gathering gloom. Behind him, Harry Chevelle's British cavalry, equipped with swords, are itching for a fight. The Australians only have an 18-inch bayonet. But the Australians are closer, and time presses. Imperturbable, as always, Harry Chevelle turns to his Major General Hodgson, commanding the Australian Mounted Division, and says in that quiet voice of his, "Put Grant straight at it." Brigadier General Grant from Stawell, Victoria, commanding the 4th Light Horse Brigade, lines up 800 horsemen, 400 from Victoria, the 4th Regiment on the right, the others from the 12th Regiment, New South Wales, on the left. Walk, march. Well, that doesn't last long. They're into the trot, then the canter, then as Turkish shrapnel starts to burst overhead into a wild and frenzied gallop, the Australians yelling and waving their bayonets, the horses catching the excitement, sensing the water in the distant wells. The Turks blink. These fellas are not dismounting 800 yards away at rifle shot range. They're coming on irresistibly, galloping. Too quick for the Turks to lower their gun sights, over the trenches, then dismounting at the point of the bayonet, rounding up 800 Turks in very short order, while other light horsemen gallop straight into the town and find, mirabile dictu, the wells still intact. The German engineers gone, the demolition charge is wired, but not exploded. The horsemen are exhausted. 31 dead, but jubilant also. The way lies open to Jerusalem, and the horses get their water. It's been a long ride for these horsemen, coming all the way from the Suez Canal through the stiff fight at Romani in August 1916, the classic encirclement battles of Magdeba, Rafah, first Gaza, and for some of them even longer. They've been with Chevelle in the Horseless campaign on Gallipoli, where Chevelle was in command of the left section at Anzac.
So there were plenty of battles. The first one was at Romani in the Sinai, when he had 1,500 troopers and there were 25,000 Turks coming across the desert to take Egypt, and they were on foot. 1,500 horsemen against 25,000 soldiers. It was his organisation, that's Harry Chevelle's organisation, that stopped that movement, and the greatest moment for him was in the morning of August the 5th, 1916, when he led a reserve troop formation of 500. He actually led, a general got on a horse and led them out into the sand dunes to fight against the Turks in those massive numbers. The problem for the Turks were they had no water, they had no food, they'd run out of ammunition, because the light horse had held them. They'd retreated slowly. They did not get into a one-on-one combat, which they all wanted to do, but they would have been thrashed, of course, 17-to-1 ratio was. So for 6 hours through the night, they held the line. And so this was the battle to get hold of the water at Romani. The Turks wanted to do that and then go on and take Cairo and take Egypt, which was a British mandate. So 70 miles away, 100 kilometres away, you've got Cairo. It's all over if the Turks get through Romani.
But now they're back in the saddle again, a dozen fine regiments, each regiment consisting of 3 squadrons, each squadron divided into 4 troops, and the troops consisting of 4-man sections, 1 man to hold the horses, 3 to advance with rifle and bayonet. And yes, Jerusalem is eventually delivered from 400 years of Ottoman rule on the 9th of December. The British Commander-in-Chief, General Allenby, repudiating the vainglorious entry of the German Kaiser some 10 years before, when special gates were driven through the ancient walls, Allenby enters on foot through a side gate, the Jaffa Gate, humbly, as had another leader 1900 years before, on a donkey, that one. Yes, Beersheba and the end of Ottoman rule were necessary preconditions for the foundation of the modern state of Israel, still the only democracy in the Middle East. But now there's still heavy fighting ahead, the climactic battle of Megiddo. Allenby's plan is simple, its execution anything but. This time, the main blow will be struck on the coast and the diversionary blow on the east. So he puts the light horse in the Jordan Valley, because by this time the Turks have worked out that where the light horse are, that's where the danger will be. And they swelter through a dreadful summer of 1918, malaria rampant, but necessary to hold the Turks there and to prevent them from reinforcing their lines on the coast. And now comes the cleverness of it. Harry Chauvel, who's every bit as meticulous in his planning as John Monash is being right now on the Western Front, Harry Chauvel, through brilliant staff work, moves 3 cavalry divisions right across the face of the Turkish armies to hide them in the olive groves and the orange orchards on the coast, leaving in the Jordan Valley the New Zealanders under Chater and also tents still standing, campfires burning at night, troops marching up and down to raise the dust during the day, 15,000 dummy horses made up of canvas and timber to fool the German pilots. They're ready to go on D-Day, the 19th of September. Harry Chauvel lets it be known that on the 19th of September there's to be a race meeting in the Jordan Valley. How Australian's that? A race meeting in the valley. At 04:30 on the 19th, Allenby's guns open up. The British infantry punch holes through the unreinforced Turkish lines, and the cavalry, Chauvel's cavalry, are through the gaps, galloping up the plain of Sharon, and then branching northeast over the saddle between Mount Carmel and Samaria, debouching at the ancient fortress of Megiddo onto the Esdraelon plain and the Jezreel Valley, the Armageddon of the Bible, the Armageddon of 1918. Well, the 7th and the 8th armies have been cut off from their rear echelons. The Turks have removed from their supplies on the coast. The 4th Army in the valley sees what happens to the 7th and the 8th on the coast, and they give up too. They're retreating towards Damascus. First Squadron, Kingsford Smith's crowd, they were very, very good, and at the Battle of Megiddo, they were, of course, ahead of the cavalry. They were dropping bombs on communication centres and disrupting the Turks no end.
Beersheba, by the way, for all the historians who've been mouthing this for 100 years, was not the last great cavalry charge. This was 1917. The cavalry and light horse, they were one and the same at virtually at this point, won another 12 major charge battles, the major one being from then on being at Galilee, where they took on German army and also Turkish army and defeated them at the Galilee.
Damascus, the big city. Harry plans an encircling, once again, an encircling battle. But when Brigadier Wilson of the 3rd Light Horse Brigade looks at the rugged periphery on the west of the big city, he gambles on a shortcut. He'll go straight through. And so a certain Major Alden, commanding a squadron of the 10th Light Horse Regiment from Western Australia, finds himself on the steps of the town hall, bluffing the civil governor into believing that already the city is encircled. Fatalistically, the civil governor, Emir Said, says, we welcome the British Army, but there's no more time for ceremonies, and Alden and his troopers are galloping back out through the gate leading to Homs. They're on the Homs Road. They're looking at Aleppo. It's been perhaps the most far-reaching and most complete victory, this climactic battle of Megiddo. Nothing certainly more so in the First World War. But the Anzacs leave cities intact, hospitals working, refugees protected, prisoners of war cared for.
Monash came from humble background. His parents had migrated here from Prussian Poland and spoke German, and he did as well. And he was actually born in Australia and lived in Melbourne, but also in country New South Wales in Jerilderie for a time, but then showed very extraordinary development at school. He was a very bright boy, and he was sent to Scots College on a scholarship, and eventually became the joint dux of Scots College. So he was already showing his brilliance. But then he went on to Melbourne University, and he graduated not only in arts, but he also graduated in engineering, and he also graduated in law. So, and eventually he became a Master of Law at University of Melbourne, which is a very unusual degree. But he came from a Jewish background. His parents were Jewish. He was brought up as a Jew, and that also made him an outsider, because clearly it was very unusual for a military commander to be a Jew anywhere in the world, let alone Australia or Britain. So he was, again, probably subjected to this discrimination. He was a reservist, he was an outsider, he'd come from Germany, or his parents had come from Germany. He had probably a slight German accent, it is said, when he spoke, and he had a Jewish background. So for all these reasons, he was the outsider, the most unlikely person to be commanding a major battle on the Western Front. Nevertheless, because of his skill at command and leadership, he had that natural, innate ability to lead other men. It was said by the military historian Bean and Mr. Murdoch, who was a journalist at the time, that Monash was too ambitious. He was only in it for himself, saying, this guy's a Jew, we don't want him. You know, so there's this anti-Semitism involved. Clearly Bean was anti-Semitic, there's a lot of evidence for that, and was against Monash. It said, you know, because he was, had this anti-Semitism, and said, we don't want any Jews telling us what to do. They had primed Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister at the time, both Murdoch and Bean, to come over to the Western Front as a visitor and say, sorry, General Monash, we don't need you anymore. We don't want you anymore. Your services are no longer required because we've heard bad things about you. But Monash had so much support from his people, from the many that he was commanding. They actually loved him. They thought he was fantastic. And they said that to Billy Hughes. How could you possibly remove this man? He's such a great commander. Monash also learnt a lot from the failures at Gallipoli, because he was a commander in Gallipoli. He was a colonel, and he was promoted to brigadier at Gallipoli. So he witnessed all the bad things that happened to our troops in Gallipoli, and he probably said to himself, I can do better than this.
The two greatest generals to come out of the war were blooded themselves on Gallipoli. That's John Monash and Harry Chauvel. They learnt all they wanted to know about the British High Command and how they operated. Monash saw very quickly that there was a level of incompetence and an attitude that he didn't agree with and that Harry didn't agree with, that is, using the men as cannon fodder. So they got that lesson very early. Harry remains with a light horse in Egypt. He's going to fight the Turks. Monash is then sent to the Western Front. Monash is in charge. He's given the charge of the 3rd Division, called the Dinkhams, because they were feeding him. They knew about Gallipoli and they were coming over to fight. He trained them up very well. He knew about the tank development. He knew about planes. He was a gunner himself. He knew all about artillery. And so he was going to use all these things to protect his men. In other words, they'd come in and mop up after he'd won with the machinery, if you like. And this was a very different mentality, and it wasn't catching on. The king came down to see him at Salisbury Plain. He'd heard about this fellow. Now, this is in September 1916. The timing is vital. They've just had the summer on the Somme where millions have died, and there's stalemate, and it looks like the Germans are going to win. Monash has 2.5 hours reviewing the 3rd Division with the king. The king realises this man is a military genius, and he realises also that he wants battle honours. But the key moment wasn't that realisation. It wasn't the articulation of what they were looking at in terms of all the 30,000 men marching past. It was a moment when the king said, if we win the war, and Monash, without regard for protocol, said, if we win, both entourages froze. I've read the diaries of both the key people there. Apart from the king's attitude and Monash's, it's all very clear. This was a shocking moment. What would the king say? He said, oh, of course we'll win. You're right. We'll win right enough. And rambled on. Then the king goes to Haig and says, elevate this man as fast as possible. Haig doesn't know who he is, really. He says, oh, you mean Curry from, isn't he from Ontario, Melbourne, Ontario? And the king, in his diaries, is quoted as saying, no, Douglas, I mean Monash from Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. You should travel more, Douglas, says the king to him. From that moment on, Monash is the king's favourite, as long as he begins to win battles. Haig is not so sure. He doesn't know. He knows his job is dependent on the king. So he then does elevate Monash, and Monash performs at a very high rate, very early. So then he gets control, Monash gets control of the Australian force because he has both Haig and the king behind him. But he does it on merit. When Ludendorff attacked in March with 1 million men over 70 kilometres, Monash, 3rd Division, and McLagan, 4th Division, Australia, stopped them. 60,000 Australians stopped the advance of the Germans. He was the key commander, and virtually the Brits, who did not want the Australian army to form, had to admit that Monash, if they're going to do it under political pressure, this character was the one to do it. So Monash took control of the force.
And then he commanded the Battle of Hamel. He planned the battle very meticulously. It was a very innovative battle. It hadn't been done really like that before, where he had air support. He had tank support of the infantry, so the infantry could advance with the tanks and be protected by the tanks. And he used firepower from artillery in a way that would confuse the enemy about the timing of when the troops would arrive. And so all of that was very innovative. The combined use of all those modalities and deception of to the enemy to let them know, no, we're not attacking now. And the secrecy of the operation, all of that was maintained, the meticulous timing. As well as that, Monash managed to bring in the Canadians and the US into that battle, I think the Brits as well, but he had over 1,000 US troops. The first time ever that a foreign commander was given the authority to command US troops in battle. It was done reluctantly by General Pershing at the time, but it did happen. And the thing about that battle was that he planned it to last 90 minutes. But how long did it last? 93 minutes. So that just shows you the meticulous planning that went into that undertaking, and everything went like clockwork, which is very unusual in any battle. They were victorious, the Allies, particularly the Australians, were victorious against the Germans.
Then he put up the big battle plan for Army R. This was to use 3 armies and destroy the Germans in front of them. Now at that time, Ludendorff was telling the Kaiser, we're going to smash through Army R and take Paris. The war will be over by Christmas. We're going to do it long before Christmas. Monash says, let's attack now. Let's do it as fast as we can. So Curry thinks, okay, if it's Monash's battle plan and it's Australians and Canadian primarily, that's their force, I'm in. So the French are off. He's got the Canadians who are terrific fighters on his right flank, and they smash through 2 German armies to cut it down in 48 hours. Monash gets everything he wants. He didn't get everything he wanted before the battle started, a couple of little issues, but he got them during the war because he had such dominance. He was virtually telling British generals to get out of the way. What peeved Monash was that he wasn't allowed to then smash through east and finish the war by the middle of August. Heinz Guderian, who ran the German tank forces in World War II, said, and he had the best quote of all, he said, they had their boot on our throat and they took it off. So the war went on for another 3 months, another 1 million lives were lost, and by the middle of August, not October or September, the Germans began to sue for peace. They knew they couldn't win. The quote, of course, that everyone knows from Ludendorff, we could not now win the war, we could only defend. There were a lot more quotes about the fact they were finished, gone. But Monash was told to park his army southeast. Therefore, the main force that had dominated at that point was told to have a rest, you've done a wonderful job. The Brits did not understand, the High Command, there wasn't the flow of information sources there is today. They just didn't grasp how big the breakthrough was. Haig knew it was massive because when he was in front of the Australian generals and Monash, he burst out crying. And one of the generals said to Monash, well, that was a bit of a surprise. And Monash said, he's just realised he's not going to go down in history as the man who lost the British Empire. It's not surprising that he reacted that way. Monash effectively organised a 100-day blitzkrieg from early June right through to early October, about 90 to 100 days. And he scythed through 39 German divisions and he destroyed every single division. He just went straight through them, a knife through butter. It was just the superior organisation and brilliance of Monash as a general.
There was still the Battle of Mons and Quentin, which was one of the final battles, which again Monash had drawn up the plans for that battle, and again the Australians and the Allies were victorious in the Battle of Mons and Quentin, which was a key battle that again tipped the tide to force the end of World War I and then onto the armistice.
And he hated the whole business. You know, he wrote that famous letter, I hate the business of war, because it was a man with his intellect and sensitivity. This was a terrible time, but he had the guts and the genius to pull it off.
Now, Monash clearly was very pleased with all the things that were happening, and he was writing that to his wife back in Australia. But and all those writings have come out. But the critics would say, oh, Monash was writing all this stuff about how great he was and how great these battles, you know, he was boasting and carrying on. Well, of course, there was a private letters to his wife. Of course, he was delighted and proud of what he'd achieved. Who wouldn't be? What's wrong with that? So we can't hold that against Monash. But the fact is, he was an outstanding general.
There were hundreds of Indigenous soldiers in the first AIF, people who were not actually citizens at the time, but volunteered to fight in the first AIF, were accepted on their merits as soldiers and came home to a country which wanted to treat them as a second class, not even a citizen.
So at the outbreak of the First World War, Indigenous Australians, mostly Aboriginal Australians at that time, not a lot of Torres Strait Islanders, they came later into the Second World War, but Aboriginal Australians did join up. Most recruiters ignored the fact that they were Aboriginal. The recruiters, well, they wanted manpower. So what they did was when they recruited, they would sign you up and then they would send you to a depot, and at the depot is where you got weeded out. And under the Defence Act, basically it states you have to be of European extraction. So what happened was and it was at the medical officer's discretion. So what would happen was the medical officer would either be racist and say no, or he ran by the rules, said no, or he didn't care either. And the interesting thing about that is a lot of Aboriginal men who were knocked back in one place would go somewhere else. And, you know, there are stories of some men having 4 goes at it before they got in. You know, I mean, these men are keen. When you look at non-Indigenous Australians, if they joined up and they were knocked back, they went, well, I've done my bit and I'm going home. So there was a wage thing. There would have been a bit of propaganda as well, because a lot of these young men, if they were 1 or 2 generations Indigenous, they were usually in mission stations and they would have been educated, which is quite surprising because all these people are well educated, and they would have got some form of propaganda. But I think the other thing is too, and that's what a lot of Indigenous servicemen today go, I'm protecting Australia and I'm protecting my piece of country. They're not actually talking about a foreign, you know, looking after England.
The call to arms was out to all the Commonwealth, and Australia answered the call, but Aboriginal men at the time couldn't join. So I found that very unique, that 4 brothers from Lake Conda Mission. Granny Hannah Lovett was our matriarch. 4 of the boys wanted to go off the war. 5 of 1, and Uncle Sam was too young at the time. Yeah, Granddad joined for 4 Flight Horse as a replacement in 1917, and had a unique opportunity last year to go to Israel, the 100-year anniversary of the charge of Beersheba, and follow the same footsteps as my grandfather. So, on reflection, obviously over there in Israel, following the footsteps of Granddad and the 4 Flight Horse, but also back home on country, our Gunditjmara lands, just overlooking some of our ancestral land and reflecting on where Granddad was. It was a long way from home, and certainly not to be recognised as an Australian citizen at the time was something that I really took to heart and wondered why that was the case. And done a little bit of research on it, and simply the policies at the time excluded Aboriginal people from participating in the growth of this country. But Uncle Herbert, Granddad's brother, Uncle Herbert lobbied very hard on their return from active service, and in fact Granddad and Uncle Herbert joined World War II as well, and served in the local militia, never went overseas. So yeah, it's just to have a family member in every theatre of war is very unique. My service seen me go to East Timor and Afghanistan. Just out of Hayward, that's where the family grew up, all the Lovetts and all the Gunditjmara people, a lot of clans. They were given a plot called Greenvale, and I actually thought that was after soldier resettlement. I thought they got the land for soldier resettlement, but in fact it was gifted to them from a Benevolent Society out of Hamilton. So even after World War I, on active service, coming back home, returning to the mission because that was the policies of the time. Then Granddad and Uncle Herbert looking for soldier resettlement claims. We refused soldier resettlement as well. And the Gunditjmara clans, Lake Conda Mission, where all the families were at the time, was actually divided up for soldier resettlement. So our ancestors lost their land through settlement, and through acts of policies, Granddad and Lovett brothers couldn't be gifted land under the Soldier Resettlement Act. So it was a very unique period in our family's time.
Personal qualities were, I think, a man who was had this incredible background of knowledge to start with. He had a prepared mind. He was an innate leader of men and women, in this case mainly men. He had the foresight to understand what might happen if things were done a certain way. But he also had an incredible passion for his military work and for all his work. That passion is one of the key features of fine leadership. But he also had an incredible rapport and care for the men under his command. He was very concerned about their welfare, and he was asked to stay behind at the end of the First World War until all of his people were repatriated back to Australia. And he did. He stayed there till the very end and made sure they all got home. But he was a very highly respected man at that time. He was loved by the general public, so much so that during the Depression there was the feeling that maybe the government were hopeless and not managing things properly. Maybe we should change the government. So there were plans for an insurrection, for an overtake of the current government at that time, and Monash was asked to lead the insurrection, but he said, "No, I'm not going to do that. The only way to allow Australia to prosper in the future is through the ballot box and education." Through the ballot box and education. In other words, democracy is the way to move Australia forwards with an educated population. Monash was keen on giving something back to the community, giving something back, always giving something back, another example of fine leadership. And he said that throughout his life, that he was giving something back, and that he thought that all Australians should give something back to the community. He said that.
To such men and to all those commanded by Monash and Chauvel, we, Australian inhabitants, whether our ancestors were here 60,000 years ago, and whether we ourselves arrived and took up residence yesterday, we owe our freedom and some of our finest ideals: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. They are the four characteristics chosen for the four pillars at Isurava on the Kokoda track. Courage, of course, as Sir William Slim always said, courage is the first of the virtues, because without it none of the others would be possible. Endurance was certainly the case for the light horse in the desert campaigns, particularly in terms of the lack of water. It's calculated in the official history. I'm not a horseman, I don't know, but in those conditions 5 gallons per horse per day is what they were looking for, and very rarely got. And many's the occasion when a light horseman would take out his own quart bottle, a quart's just a bit more than a litre, and moisten his hands to moisten the muzzle of the horse. They had to care for their horses very, very much so. Mateship, of course, is fundamental to the Australian character, as we like to think of it at any rate. It is very prominent in warfare, particularly in both world wars. I'm not sure when the term was coined, whether we go back to the diggers and the goldfields, or even the convicts having to band together to survive. But mateship is fundamental. And of course there's the very famous story of the horseman riding Bill the Bastard, the huge horse that nobody else could ride except this major, at the Battle of Romani, managing to go back and rescue 4 diggers. 3 of them, I think, on the back of the horse, and one of them hanging onto the stirrups, and bringing them out of the battle, and even going back again to look for others. That's mateship. Sacrifice, of course, is the saddest story of all. Over 60,000 Australians killed in the First World War. There's been nothing like it before, nothing like it since. After the war, for 25 years, until his death in 1945, he's a church warden at Christchurch, South Yarra. That's where his sword is to this day. He's created a lay canon of the St Paul's Cathedral. There's a plaque on the left-hand aisle there which records his Christian regard for his men, which was undiminished during the years of peace. Lest we forget.